thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to connect with a few of you after 5 years, and after COVID, I'm coming back to Vienna. I would like, since I am going to talk about rethinking brick, and given that I come from a very old civilization, which is India, and given that my experience has been from the perspective of the countries that are not mainstream industrialized. So even though we take brick, you know, when we are here in Europe, there's a certain connotation with brick in today's times. I would like to just see it a little bit globally, because brick is the very first manufactured material that humans ever manufactured, you know, before they just did things custom made. So brick was like the first Lego, and it could modularize. But unlike Lego, you could make any curves and you could do anything with it, because the brick was very, it was not chasing higher and higher strength. It was depending on the clay you had, depending on the fuel you had, you just baked clay so that it was water resistant. And it was very simple when it all began, 3,800 years ago, when humans discovered that fire can magically transform clay. So, you know, what I find very poetic, and I love bricks, I'm very happy here to start this today's day with brick, all this brick talk, because I personally find it very magical that these basic elements, earth, water, fire, and air, have to be very carefully in the alchemy of all what each does to the other. You get this material which humans have begun architecture with in a way. So now that there have been major socio-economic transitions like industrialization, a certain way of consuming any amount, you know, we make bricks out of any clay to get any color. So it has taken on a very different complexity. But it doesn't mean that all bricks consume necessarily all those generalized figures. So I like to share how that journey began for me. And I come from Bombay. When I moved to South India in a rural area to practice, I started to take the time to discover how humans have begun to create material extraction in the first place. And so it is no more for me whether a particular brick is more sustainable than another material. It is a question of where is it produced, what clay was there, what way was used. You know, so formerly, before industrialization, this is a brick mold that, you know, in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, in that area, the first civilization, urban development is seen. So they still make bricks pretty much in that same way in rural India. You have a mold in which you throw a brick. Sorry to take you all to the beginning. And this is how fast it goes. If you don't, like the factory has, we assume that handmade is much more time intensive, but if you look at the way this is automatically done, kind of, in pairs of 2, and how these hands know exactly how much they are throwing in, it is exactly, it looks light, but it's very heavy, this wet earth. And so this is what is very hypnotizing. This is in today's time, okay? It's being produced. Already the brick mold has become much higher and imitating the industrial brick module already. But the whole question of brick is the module. What is the module? And earlier, these bricks were, you know, made according to the clay that collected in that area, and you know that needed to be spent. Or it was not like industrial quarries and so on. You just had, if the soil you had was too clayey, then you fired it. If it was too sandy, you used it as rammed earth. And there were so many other techniques to build with earth, one of which was to fire earth. And so in a very agricultural context, and much of the world, whether in Africa and many other places that are not completely industrialized, you have this very basic connect to building housing. And today, sadly, brick has been reduced to a mere filler material, as if it's not even allowed to take load in many countries. They are not in the codes automatically allowed to build domes and everything what our ancestors did, bigger and bigger spans, higher and higher buildings, complex buildings like Notre Dame, Hagia Sophia. Suddenly, we see this landscape of brick as a vernacular material that is not allowed to carry weight. And that's where my own interest in the material began, because this is what we see all over India. And then I found out also all over the world, including Australia. It's called brick veneer and things like that. It's just applied on top to look like brick. But the actual brick stacking, before we talk about sustainability issues, I think it's important to remember how did the early humans fire their bricks. And usually bricks were just stacked. The kiln is the stack. And that's the beauty of the brick. It was stacked in a manner like a Jenga tower, and you have to allow all these airflow movements. And then, they are thrown and arranged and so on. So the product in the kiln and the kiln are all fluent. So the outer bricks are less cooked, and they are used in the interior of the walls. The inner, instead of getting the entire thing to reach, the entire brick to reach a certain standard of firing, which we have now, in post-industrial systems, I feel that over-standardization is making us probably have an environmental problem. This is sometimes I think about it, because we use a very high-quality thing for everything, which could also be done with a lower quality. So the lower quality brick that I understood after I started traveling in rural areas in India is not that because they made it badly. It's just that the local clay and the local fuel can only go that far. But it's enough, and it's waterproof. And the kiln, which is composed like that, as a brick stack, is then plastered with the same clay mortar and then fired. Also, the fuel used is from the thinnings of plantations that they have also themselves planted through which we use also for scaffolding, these kind of very quick growing casuarina. But anyway, what I started noticing in the sustainability discussion, that all material sourcing is a socio-economic kind of activity. And if you see it in isolation, I mean, these people who probably fire lime at the same time, there are lime kilns, people making all these materials from what they have around them. But they're also farmers, and they're also doing so many other activities, not just doing an 8-hour job somewhere. So all the costs, everything collapses if you stop using one local brick. The entire other activities get affected. So through that kind of understanding, when I first began my early projects, I started favoring locally made bricks, because I found that in the South India, they were still making bricks of that kind of proportion, 2.5 centimeters high, using lime mortar. So I tried to I felt like you don't have to design what is still functioning. Just design, go around it and continue what still works. So these are some of those buildings. And if you notice, the brick patterns are also different, because they are not the bricks. The early pre-industrial brick module is not necessarily 1:2. So not every brick course has to be drawn. It can be done by the craftsman also. But then, since I achieved certain buildings through this kind of, let's say, a little bit bottoms up when it comes to human skills and capacities, and also to some extent enlarging the capacities and building knowledge while building buildings, I got to know the pottery community and started to produce for my architecture some other elements with the same fired clay, so that we could fire them also locally in the way bricks were produced, so that with these kind of materials we could achieve roofing systems And I did several kinds of roofing systems gradually as I went along. But this one, for example, represents a little bit the direction where I think materials have a future, where you could use human progress and human knowledge that we are gathering of engineering to use far less materials, to support those, to build many more square meters with the same materials, or to do it more intelligently, and to also use what you have abundance of, instead of having a material fetish to try to get something because you is now in fashion or now you love it. If you just see what is around you with new eyes and create materials that would do the place good. And if there's a lot of labor, if there are pottery skills, what you have in abundance, if you build with that, then it's going to give a very economic formula. So through this kind of approach, I started my practice with 23 years, actually, immediately after graduating. And that was the first building for which I had done this kind of roof. I came, like I said, from Bombay to an area like this. And I felt that if you just repeat the concrete slabs, then you would create first a heating problem, then you'll have to go and cool it with an air conditioning. So I was looking for an alternative roofing system, and that's how the journey began. The brick walls and all that came later. So this is an example of that house where, I'm also using lime mortar, and I have stabilized it with 10% of cement so that it sets quickly and matches the pace of today's construction. But then I went on to produce other roofing systems as the research went along. This is, for example, a kind of a jack arch type of system where you can use it inside between prefabricated beams. And because you can't use everything in catenary bolts when you need to use the ceiling, so the roof. So as a floor, I mean. And so this is still an insulated final floor that is flat. But then I've also used bricks in a similar way for intermediate floors. While I went along with this, I developed also in that, it's like what I felt is it's an infinity that of things you can invent and continue to do. Because that's why I believe in building the knowledge rather than just building the building. Because if you build knowledge, then you build a community, and that with that community you learn, it unfolds into many other expressions. Like here, this is the original ceramic cooking pot that those people there produced, which actually nobody uses anymore as a daily basis, but they still keep producing it for festivals and so on. I used these materials as a formwork to reduce the steel expenditure in concrete slabs by doing a lot of the intelligent concrete applications need complicated formwork, and the formwork becomes expensive. So I made a kind of lost formwork. I know this word in German, verlorene Schalung. So because I tried so hard to explain that this is not a decorative thing, the idea is that the bigger the span, the more steel you save. Because after a while, concrete has a self-weight problem. So then you can make the whole slab thick, and then you carve out the holes in it. But then I also started doing brick vaults and everywhere, and I started using bricks wherever I could initially, because I was in an area where this was the ancient material, and also in places like Berlin, when you see all the main houses, if the plaster breaks, you see there's bricks. So that means that the earth there is good for making bricks out of it. So I felt that many people feel a brick is just a brick, but I felt that there is, in any material, in even any vernacular technology, there is so much more optimization to be done. We don't have to start with the industrial materials. We can do those, and we can also revisit ancient, timeless materials and probably use them in different ways, or in any case, optimize. So this is the resulting house, which is known as wall house. It's my own house, actually. That's why I could experiment more. I'm focusing on one example where different techniques are there, but you see them in piecemeal in many of my projects. And I also used this project to test various ideas so that the clients don't have to feel like they are taking a major risk and being used as guinea pigs. But see, the back wall there is rammed earth. So when the earth is sandy, I was testing this also for another project. So my house was like a laboratory. Because I didn't want to make false promises to my clients. Because I wanted that if they come on board, they should also be willing to take risks, because I don't want to promise some illusion, you know. We have to know where we feel secure and where we are experimenting. So in many of the other low-cost housing that I later did, I found that a lot of the techniques that I was working on turned out, even though the budget for those projects, my first project was not my own house, it was for a French client who had quite a generous budget. But it turned out in the end that it was also the most affordable one when we did other low-cost housing. So that was a very flattering outcome for me to see that in all these matters, I couldn't come up with a cheaper roofing system. Even bus sheds, etc., they have been using them now. Or this one is a kind of a vocational training center for students to learn carpentry, etc. And this one, this system I tested in my house was for this project, which is a co-housing project. So that the roof is like a big insulated umbrella and the intermediate floors don't need insulation. And these elements were extracted on site and produced also on site to some extent. And then these are some of the other wire cut bricks, we call them, because the others are ground molded, cheap bricks. This is a little more industrial, and in other places in India, I have done projects of this kind, sometimes plastered, where the monsoon blasts on it, and wherever possible exposed, and also a lot of public buildings like this Braille library. And these are very humble budgets, very social buildings. And this is a more recent one, which is a daycare center. In this case, I wanted to make the building look like a very stable. I didn't want to keep it unplastered largely. I wanted it to look like a very stable, solid institutional building, because the children who grow up here, they come from very difficult backgrounds. And I wanted them to have a sense that we go to a very stable, very solid, permanent building. And to keep the feeling of, you know, the porosity here, even for them, I used the terracotta screens as walls, because this is again a very low budget building, and I preferred to have porous walls and have a very solid roof and a very solid structure to look like how, you know, that they come somewhere and get security. Now I'm going to show you, is it okay with the time still? Okay. I'm going to just show you a more radical direction of rethinking bricks, because of course in the Western post-industrialized world, we are rethinking in certain directions which involve more machines, also robots, and you know, we are aware of those directions. But I also feel I want to give you an illustration of one project that I did as my PhD project, but I also built in this kind of techniques that I find it even very, very, I mean, people would look at the images and call it low-tech, but I feel some of the things that you all called low-tech is what I would call high-tech, because it needs much more knowledge and wisdom and a lot of engineering knowledge and a lot of experience by craftsmen and all that. So these I feel are harder to calculate for computers, you know, and but that doesn't mean it's harder for the human to calculate. You know, if you just want to outsource it to some program, these things look hard. But I want to take you in this direction. I would also like to just mention here, I don't know how many people remember, I was mentioning it earlier today, Wienerberger had supported the making of a film by Harun Farokhi. Does anybody know Harun Farokhi? I hope some of you know. He's a very famous German documentary filmmaker. He passed away, actually. He was. And he had made very amazing films, you know, that have been shown in the very best of the high-end museums and galleries. But one of his films was called Zum Vergleich, in which he shows 7 techniques of brick making. I really suggest that everybody should see that film. He wants you to just observe how a brick is made. Nothing else happens in the film. 7 chapters. First, they make a brick in Africa. Then they make a brick in India. Then they make a brick, etc. It goes up to Switzerland. Then they show how bricks are made. And just by watching how a brick is made, you come to know about the socio-economic realities, if women are going to work with the children or not, what is the sound, how humans are singing and, you know, making bricks in Africa. And then there's only a screeching machine, and in some other context, there's only one button to press. And, you know, he's just explained the world and all our human differences of our economies and societies through the making of a single brick. So I strongly recommend, and I mention it here because I met him in this connection because this project is a chapter in that film, because he had approached me to include it in the film. This is a very radical way of thinking brick. So brick was actually modularized so that it can be fired in a factory and then assembled and laid in a site. Ray Meeker, the Californian ceramist whom I met and I also worked with, I also did some buildings in this technique later. I was intrigued by his pioneering work in this direction, that he felt that about 40% of the heat you generate when you make bricks, it goes into the kiln wall again and again and again. You need 980 degrees, and about a large portion of that goes into the kiln walls. So he got the idea that if you were to make the house as a temporary kiln, fill it up with bricks and other ceramic products, and then the heat which you would lose in the firing, the fuel cost would be attributed to the bricks, product bricks inside, but the house would get fired for free. This is a bit simplistic. How I'm saying it is a very hard concept. Even to fire a large pot is very hard. But it's like many things change if you can do this. It's a very, very complex thing. But for the typical people who make bricks, who know the clay, etc., it's not so hard. It's hard for us in the development phase, and this technology is in its infancy. What it does is, because you modularize and produce it on site, but you assemble it with the same clay, you don't need cement. First advantage. Then you get a pattern that the uneven firing is not pixelated. You see it like brush strokes, about like how the fire moved, and you can see different colors. But the whole thing is a unified, vitrified product, a large house being produced like a large pot, actually, which is, like I said, theoretically, for the price of a mud house, you're getting the waterproof qualities like a brick house. And in this system, we have, in my PhD, we had analyzed all types of other kilns and houses that could, what are the fuel types, what are the types of kilns, and how those kilns could lead to different systems, could lead to different architectures if you were to reuse it, double it up. So this is just, this is one of the houses I have designed and built according to those principles. But one I'm going to show you now is, by the end of it, by doing this house, I realized that it's the walls that have to be very thick. And then there's a trouble firing the thickness of the wall. So when I analyzed all his structures, did the PhD, and by the end of it, I thought the best is not to have walls and to do the whole thing like shells. So, and catenary curves tend to become quite vertical at the base. So instead of having a thick wall like that, just a thin 15 centimeter or 10 is enough. So I produced, it was homes for homeless children which had no budget anyhow, and they were cozy spaces, so I composed all of this in that principle, and I think we might have got quite a high fuel efficiency here, since the whole structure could easily fire through. We use these bicycle wheels, etc., to do the form work, because we didn't have a budget and we were trying to save wherever we could and reuse other things, even in the process. One of the interesting things we did here also, I have to mention, is that instead of using wood or coal to fire this building, we took coal dust, which is a product that you can get from all the kilns and all the industries. You can sweep the floors, collect the dust. There is some calorific value left. So Ray Meeker analyzed that if you added 5% of this to the clay, then first and put it in the firing, then by the time the fuel is spent, it is burnt. So the next layers catch fire. Very complicated, sorry if I'm going too much in detail. But basically, it's another technique because there's also reuse of fuel, and the efficiency of this was, I think we were trying to target being much less. I mean, I was telling Ray, it doesn't matter if you're already saving the waste heat of the other brick kilns, it's already performing well. And he was saying, no, if it doesn't really, there's no sense in taking all the trouble if you're not radically efficient with the energy, and many layers of rethinking. So it looks like a humble vernacular project, but I want to show you, see down there, it's full of rethinking, So down there, you see the oxygen has to come in here for combustion, and the other holes are to just start the fire. And then this is how the dome ends, the firebox, as I just explained. Then you have to stack the first layer like you would do a barbecue grill. You have to allow the air to come in from the bottom. And then in some intermediate layers, we've used some of the coal. We found it to be less than starting the fire with wood thinnings. So there are many different fuels we've tried, and this is only in some layers to just give it the first boost, because it's the first time we were doing this kind of technique. But basically in other layers, you're just filling the brick up, not like the previous kilns where you have to leave space for the air to move around, because this spreads by contact. So that's also easier. And then the whole mud plaster is applied, and it takes about 3 or 4 days to bake. It also cracks, but it also cools. So it all closes again. And then you harvest all the bricks, and you can finish the structure with it, or you can sell those bricks. And I think what was interesting for me is that you can manufacture any sizes, you can do whatever you want. See, at the back, you see there's a wall where it looks a bit like lava because it got overburnt some areas. It's the first experiment. And at the same time, you can also, this technology has a potential to look at housing as a producer of local building materials rather than a consumer of materials. And therein comes in the local economy and all those aspects. But there's so much ceramic we use, from toilet pans to, tiles, furniture, water pipes, gargoyles. And then because it's a vitrified technology, I also did the finishing of these domes with broken chai cups and waterproofed them with broken tiles, which are also ceramic but sophisticated. I will just run you through the fact that is it time up? Okay, I'm going to end here, but I'll just show you just the images of Wall House in 2012 in David Chipperfield's curated Venice Biennale. We had the space to build it one-to-one. It was called Common Ground, and I thought that because Venice is built out of brick, the best is to show the whole time that lapsed and to build this project in full scale, which some of you may have visited. And I mentioned just this, Louisiana, that had a solo show of my work called Taking Time. In that exhibition, various materials were shown in depth, but all of these models were, apart from spatial models, they were in, one is to 5-scale tectonic models. At the back, you see the voluntariat homes for homeless children. Thank you. Sorry for shooting the time. Take this water.
Thank you, Anupama, very much for sharing your experiences with us. Rethink Brick, I think quite amazing experience, even from a European perspective, quite unusual for us. So I am sure there is a couple of questions. Ich bin sicher, Sie haben noch einige Fragen.
Es kann auch auf Deutsch sein.
Sie dürfen auch auf Deutsch fragen. Es gibt Mikrofone. Wer möchte noch etwas nachfragen? I have a question, Anupama. I think you have this experience of India and Europe. And you mentioned the post-industrial era and the vernacular know-how and technologies in India. And there is a gap, obviously. How do you think can we close the gap?
I actually don't think there is really a gap on a deeper level, because I actually, maybe that's my Indian perspective, I don't know. I think we are more common than different. That's what I told Chipperfield also when I took this project there, because it was called Common Ground. I was saying that in our mental way of perceiving a problem in the West, we tend to feel we are focusing too much on our differences. But if you focus on the commonalities, we are even quite common to the monkey. If you look at the, it's a question of perspective. So I think it's just in the way we all live in our made-up narratives in our head. So sometimes we get along, or when we focus on what is not common, instead of celebrating the difference, if the commonality is established, we tend to have fights and confrontations, and we want everybody. I think this is a problem, not of the West and the East. This is my personal perspective. I think it's a problem of industrialization. And just because we did everything in machines and now we're doing it with robots, we don't have to become the robot, but we are becoming in this part of the world. We think that we grow up, I think maybe you all grow up with SML and all those things. And you're used to everything should be put into this. If it is not this, it must be this. But we are used to we are not only thinking in terms of standardization. And that's the main thing. Like just because I got an idea, in the West, they would ask me, I know some question will come, which says, how are we going to scale up now? How are we all going to make this? So we won't. In India, no one asks that, because, one person goes home, plays his own violin how he wants, make his own music, You don't have to. You go together, then you find, okay, if we have to play together, then we'll find the common ground. Otherwise, I just play my own thing, solve my problem. So I think it's the perspective. And I'm very afraid that some of the Western standardized thinking is going to come to these countries, and they are going to suddenly increase the consumption pattern, because all of us have to now, just because somebody knows how to press a button and move the curtain, all of us have to have it. Even I like to move my hand. But because it has to be standard now, we all have to have such a high standard for even a house. Even in the West, people are spending most of their energy, most of the salary in the housing rent, if you just compare what's happening, I don't think otherwise there's too much of a difference. We are all Homo sapiens. And if we mess up, we are all going to suffer.
Thank you very much for your intervention.
Thank you.
We enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Thanks. And one last point. If you are poor, like I didn't know till I left India that we are considered a poor country by the others. So you realize if you're poor, you can't afford to be stupid. You have to think and use your resources, because it's a question of life or death. And that's not a bad thing.
Not at all.
To remain clever. Thank you.
Thank you, Anupama. Thank you.